Picture this: a gas station parking lot, a millionaire in an expensive suit, a pregnant woman staggering backward from the force of his slap. But what the abusive husband didn't know was that the cashier watching through those windows wasn't just any employee, he was an Army Ranger. And that pregnant woman? She was his sister. What happened next would expose a web of corruption reaching into hospitals, police departments, and courtrooms. A criminal empire built on silencing women, and a pattern of accidents that had been claiming victims for over 15 years. This isn't just a story about one moment of violence. It's about what happens when a trained soldier decides that some battles can't be won in courtrooms. It's about discovering that your worst enemy has been planning your destruction for months. And it's about learning that sometimes the most dangerous predators wear expensive suits and donate to charity. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this gas station confrontation became national news, how a millionaire's perfect life crumbled in federal court, and what really happened to his previous wives who mysteriously disappeared. The sound echoed across the gas station parking lot like a gunshot. Rebecca Sullivan's hand flew to her cheek, the sting radiating through her face as she staggered backward. At 8 months pregnant, her balance was already precarious, and the force of her husband's blow nearly sent her tumbling. "Don't you ever question me again," Richard Blackwood hissed, his voice low and menacing despite the public setting. His expensive suit and polished shoes looked out of place at the rundown gas station on the outskirts of town. "When I'm conducting business, you keep your mouth shut." Becca's eyes filled with tears, but she knew better than to let them fall. Not here. Not in public where Rick's reputation might suffer. She pressed her palm against her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick restlessly inside her womb. "I just asked who called," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of traffic on the nearby interstate. "Your phone kept ringing during dinner, and I thought it might be important." Rick's jaw clenched as he stepped closer, forcing Becca to back against their black Mercedes. The contrast between his perfectly styled hair and the rage burning in his eyes made him look like a predator in expensive clothing. "Everything I do is important," he said through gritted teeth. "But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You with your little community college education and your pathetic attempts at independence." Inside the gas station, Jake Sullivan looked up from the lottery tickets he was restocking behind the counter. Something had caught his attention through the large windows that faced the parking lot. A man in a suit was standing too close to a pregnant woman, his posture aggressive and intimidating. Jake's trained eyes assessed the situation instantly. 20 years in the Army Rangers had taught him to recognize danger, even from a distance. The woman's body language screamed fear. Her shoulders were hunched defensively, one hand protecting her belly while the other remained pressed against her face. Then she turned slightly and Jake's world tilted on its axis. "Rebecca," he breathed, the name escaping his lips like a prayer. 4 years. 4 years since he'd seen his sister's face. 4 years since the fight that had torn their family apart. 4 years since she'd chosen Richard Blackwood's money over her own brother's warnings about the millionaire's true nature. But now, watching through the glass as Rick raised his hand again, Jake felt something primitive and protective surge through his chest. He moved without thinking, his military training overriding 4 years of hurt and silence. In one fluid motion, he yanked off his name tag and rounded the counter. The electronic chime of the door sounded almost cheerful as Jake stepped into the humid evening air. His combat boots made soft sounds on the asphalt as he approached the Mercedes. "Sir," Jake's voice carried the quiet authority he'd perfected during his years leading soldiers into battle. "I'm going to need you to step away from the pregnant woman." Rick spun around, his face flushed with anger and indignation. "Excuse me? Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Jake's gaze flicked to his sister's face, taking in the red handprint on her cheek and the fear in her eyes. When he looked back at Rick, his expression was stone cold. "Yeah," Jake said quietly. "I know exactly who I'm talking to." Becca's eyes widened as she finally registered her brother's face. "Jake!" The word came out as a strangled whisper. "Hello, Becca." Jake's voice softened fractionally when he addressed his sister, but his attention remained focused on Rick. "Are you all right?" Rick's face darkened as he processed the family resemblance between the siblings. "So this is your famous brother," he said to Becca with a sneer. "The war hero who couldn't even hold down a real job after coming home." Real job? Jake's smile held no warmth. I've got a real job. It pays the bills and lets me sleep at night. Can you say the same? I'm a millionaire real estate developer, Rick shot back. I employ hundreds of people and contribute more to this economy in a month than you make in a year. And yet you still feel the need to hit pregnant women in parking lots, Jake observed. Interesting business model. Rick's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, where Jake glimpsed the outline of a cell phone. One call, Rick said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. One call and I can have you fired from this pathetic job and blacklisted from every employment opportunity in this state. Jake shrugged. Go ahead, make your call. The casual dismissal of his threat seemed to enrage Rick further. He stepped toward Jake, his chest puffed out in an attempt to appear intimidating. You have no idea what you're dealing with, soldier boy. I have connections you can't even imagine. I'm sure you do, Jake replied calmly. But right now, the only connection that matters is the one between my fist and your face if you touch my sister again. Becca found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. Jake, please, just let us go. Rick, we should leave. The baby will be fine, Rick snapped without looking at her. Unlike your brother's career prospects. As if summoned by the tension in the air, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the small group. Detective Frank Morrison stepped out of the vehicle, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. Evening, folks, Detective Morrison said, his tone professional but wary. Is there a problem here? Jake recognized Morrison from the veteran support group meetings at the community center. The detective was a good man, someone who understood the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. No problem, Detective, Rick said quickly, his demeanor shifting to one of polite authority. Just a family discussion that got a little heated. I'm Richard Blackwood, by the way. Perhaps you've heard of Blackwood Development? Morrison's expression didn't change. I know who you are, Mr. Blackwood. The question is whether everyone here is safe and free to leave. Of course we're free to leave, Rick said, reaching for Becca's arm. Come on, Rebecca. We have dinner reservations. But Becca stepped back, moving closer to Jake. For the first time in 4 years, she felt protected instead of controlled. Actually, she said, her voice growing stronger, I think I'd like to stay and talk to my brother for a few minutes. Rick's face flushed again. Rebecca, get in the car. Now. She said she wants to talk to her brother, Jake interjected. I'd say that's her choice to make. The standoff stretched for several long seconds. Rick's fingers twitched toward his phone again, but Detective Morrison cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwood, I'd suggest you respect your wife's wishes. This is a public place, and she's free to speak with whomever she chooses. Recognizing that he was outnumbered and increasingly exposed to public scrutiny, Rick's expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. Fine, he said, his voice dripping with false civility. Rebecca, when you're done with this reunion, you can call me. I'll be at the office reviewing some family finances that might interest you. And, the threat was subtle but unmistakable. Becca's face paled as Rick climbed into the Mercedes and drove away, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and burning rubber in his wake. As the taillights disappeared into the darkness, Becca finally allowed the tears she'd been holding back to fall freely. Jake, she whispered, turning to face the brother she'd lost 4 years ago. He wasn't always like this. The baby changed everything. Detective Morrison approached cautiously, his years of experience reading domestic situations evident in his careful movements. He'd seen too many cases where family dynamics complicated already dangerous circumstances. Jake, he said, nodding to the former ranger, I didn't expect to see you here. Working nights at Murphy's Gas, Jake replied, gesturing toward the station. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Morrison turned his attention to Becca, his voice gentle but professional. Ma'am, I need to ask if you're injured and if you feel safe. Becca's hand instinctively moved to her cheek, where Rick's handprint was still visible. I'm okay, she said automatically, then caught herself. I mean, physically I'm okay. The baby's moving normally. But, Morrison prompted. Jake watched his sister struggle with the words. Even after 4 years of estrangement, he could read her like a book. She was terrified, but not just of Rick's physical violence. She was afraid of something deeper, more complex. He controls everything, Becca finally admitted. My credit cards, my bank account, even my car is in his name. If I leave, I have nothing. And with the baby coming, she trailed off, overwhelmed by the impossibility of her situation. Morrison nodded grimly. Financial abuse is one of the most effective tools domestic abusers use to maintain control. It makes leaving seem impossible. Jake's jaw clenched as the full scope of his sister's situation became clear. He'd known Rick was bad news from the beginning, but he'd never imagined the extent of the millionaire's control. "What about your inheritance from Dad?" Jake asked. "That money was supposed to be untouchable." Becca's expression crumbled. Rick said it would be better invested in his business ventures, more profitable. He had lawyers draw up papers making him the beneficiary if anything happened to me. "And you signed them?" Jake's voice was carefully controlled, but Morrison could see the fury building behind his eyes. "I was pregnant and scared," Becca said defensively. "Rick said it was just paperwork, that it would protect the baby if something happened during delivery. He said millionaire husbands know how to handle family finances better than wives with community college educations." Morrison made notes in a small notebook. "Mrs. Blackwood, has your husband ever threatened you or your unborn child?" "Not directly," Becca said, then reconsidered. "But he's made it clear that if I don't cooperate, I could lose everything. He says courts favor fathers with resources, especially when mothers have histories of mental instability." "Mental instability?" Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. "I had some postpartum depression after a miscarriage 2 years ago," Becca explained. "I saw a therapist for a few months. Rick says it's all documented and could be used against me in custody proceedings." Morrison's expression darkened. He'd seen this playbook before. Wealthy abusers who weaponize their victims' medical histories and financial dependence to maintain control. "Has he ever hit you before tonight?" Morrison asked. Becca hesitated, and that hesitation told Jake everything he needed to know. "Sometimes he loses his temper," she said carefully, "but it's usually just grabbing or shaking. Tonight was the first time he actually struck me." "That you remember," Jake said grimly, "or that left marks he couldn't explain away." Detective Morrison closed his notebook and looked directly at Becca. "Mrs. Blackwood, I want you to know that you have options. There are resources available for women in your situation. Shelters that specialize in helping abuse victims with financial constraints." "But Rick will find me," Becca said. "He has connections everywhere. Police, lawyers, judges. He's told me stories about business associates who've dealt with difficult wives." "What kind of stories?" Morrison asked sharply. Becca wrapped her arms around her belly protectively. "Women who disappeared, custody cases that went badly, accidents that seemed suspicious but were never investigated properly." Jake stepped closer to his sister, his protective instincts overriding 4 years of hurt feelings. "Becca, you can't go back to him. Not after tonight." "Where else can I go?" Becca asked desperately. "Mom won't help me because Rick pays for her assisted living facility. I don't have any money of my own, no credit cards that aren't linked to his accounts. And I'm 8 months pregnant, Jake. Who's going to hire me? Who's going to take care of me when the baby comes?" "I will," Jake said without hesitation. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of 4 years of separation and all the unresolved issues that had driven them apart. "Jake," Becca said softly, "you live in a one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store. You work nights at a gas station. How can you possibly support a pregnant woman and a newborn?" "The same way Dad would have if he were still alive," Jake replied. "Family takes care of family, no matter what." Detective Morrison watched the reunion with mixed emotions. He'd seen too many domestic violence cases end badly because victims felt they had nowhere to turn. But he'd also learned to be cautious about family members who promised more than they could deliver. "Jake," Morrison said quietly, "you need to understand what you're offering. If Mrs. Blackwood stays with you, her husband will likely escalate his efforts to regain control. Men like Richard Blackwood don't accept losing gracefully." "I've dealt with dangerous men before," Jake said. "Rick doesn't scare me." "Maybe he should," Morrison replied. "He's not just some street thug you can intimidate. He has resources, connections, and legal protection that most criminals don't possess." As if to prove Morrison's point, Jake's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed his supervisor at the gas station. "Jake," "You need to get back inside," his supervisor said without preamble. "I just got a call from corporate. Apparently, we've had some complaints about employee conduct, and there's going to be an investigation." Jake looked at Rick's Mercedes disappearing into the distance. "What kind of complaints?" "The kind that come from people with enough money to make our lives difficult," his supervisor replied. "Just get back to work and try to stay out of trouble." As Jake ended the call, Detective Morrison's phone also rang. His conversation was shorter but equally ominous. "That was my captain," Morrison said grimly. "Apparently, Richard Blackwood has filed a complaint about police harassment. I'm being assigned to other cases effective immediately." Becca's face paled as the reality of Rick's influence became clear. "He told you he had connections. This is what he meant." Jake put his arm around his sister's shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his chest like armor before a dangerous mission. "Then we'll have to be smarter than him," Jake said quietly, "and we'll need help from people he can't touch." "Who?" Becca asked desperately. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking through the limited options available to them. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I know one thing for certain. You're not going back to that house tonight. Whatever happens next, we face it together." Detective Morrison looked at both siblings, recognizing the determination in their eyes. He'd seen it before in combat veterans and abuse survivors. It was the look of people who decided to stop running and start fighting back. "If you're serious about this," Morrison said carefully, "you're going to need evidence, documentation, witnesses, and you're going to need to be prepared for Rick to fight dirty." Jake nodded grimly. "The question is, Detective, are you willing to help us build a case, even if it makes your captain unhappy?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing his career against his conscience. Finally, he handed Jake a business card. "I can't officially investigate your brother-in-law," he said, "but I might know someone who can. Someone Rick Blackwood doesn't own." As the three of them stood in the gas station parking lot, each lost in their own thoughts about the dangerous path ahead, none of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, its occupant photographing their conversation with a long-range lens. The war between Rick Blackwood and the Sullivan siblings had officially begun. Jake's hands shook slightly as he drove his battered pickup truck toward the county hospital, glancing frequently at Becca in the passenger seat. She sat hunched forward, both arms wrapped protectively around her belly. "The cramping started about 10 minutes ago," Becca said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's probably just stress, but with everything that happened tonight—" "Better safe than sorry," Jake replied, pressing down harder on the accelerator. "Dr. Hayes is good people. She'll make sure you and the baby are okay." The emergency room at County General was quiet for a Thursday night. Jake had called ahead and Dr. Patricia Hayes was waiting for them at the entrance with a wheelchair and a concerned expression. "Rebecca, right?" Dr. Hayes said, helping Becca into the chair. "Jake told me what happened. Let's get you checked out immediately." Dr. Hayes had been working in emergency medicine for 20 years, and she'd developed an eye for domestic violence cases. The defensive way Becca held herself, the fading handprint on her cheek, and the fear in her eyes all told a story Dr. Hayes had seen too many times before. In the examination room, Dr. Hayes worked with practiced efficiency, checking Becca's blood pressure and monitoring the baby's heartbeat. "Good news," Dr. Hayes said after several minutes. "Your baby's heartbeat is strong and regular. The cramping you experienced was likely stress-related, but I want to run a few more tests to be absolutely certain." "Thank you," Becca said, relief evident in her voice. "I was so scared that the stress might have hurt the baby." Dr. Hayes made notes on her tablet, then looked directly at Becca. "Rebecca, as part of our standard examination, I need to document any injuries you may have sustained. I can see some facial swelling and bruising. Can you tell me how that happened?" Becca glanced toward the door where Jake waited in the hallway. "I fell," she said automatically. Dr. Hayes had heard that lie countless times. "I see. And did you fall onto something that would leave a handprint-shaped bruise on your cheek?" The question hung in the air between them. Becca's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. "It was my husband," she whispered finally, "but it was the first time he ever hit me like that. Usually he's more careful about not leaving marks." Dr. Hayes continued her examination, noting several older bruises in various stages of healing along Becca's arms and ribs. Some were faint yellow-green marks that indicated injuries from several weeks earlier. "Rebecca, I'm seeing evidence of multiple injuries over an extended period." Dr. Hayes said gently. This pattern suggests ongoing physical abuse. Rick says I bruise easily because of the pregnancy hormones, Becca said, but her voice lacked conviction. That's medically inaccurate, Dr. Hayes replied firmly. What I'm documenting here is consistent with repeated physical violence, and I'm particularly concerned about these older injuries around your ribcage. Dr. Hayes pulled up Becca's medical records on her computer, scrolling through months of entries. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she reviewed the information. Rebecca, you've been to the emergency room 4 times in the past 6 months, Dr. Hayes said. Twice for falls, once for food poisoning, and once for what was diagnosed as severe morning sickness. Becca's face paled. I forgot about those visits. Each time you were treated by different physicians on different shifts, Dr. Hayes continued. That's a common pattern we see with domestic abuse victims. The abuser ensures the victim seeks medical care from different providers, so no single doctor sees the full picture. The major twist Jake had been dreading was becoming clear. Rick's abuse hadn't started with tonight's public slap. It had been escalating for months, carefully hidden and systematically documented in a way that made it nearly impossible to detect. Dr. Hayes, Becca said quietly, what happens if I officially report this? Rick says he has connections in the hospital administration. Dr. Hayes' expression hardened. Rebecca, I've been practicing emergency medicine for 2 decades. I've dealt with wealthy, influential abusers before. My job is to protect patients, not hospital donors. As if summoned by the mention of Rick's influence, Dr. Hayes' pager buzzed with an urgent message. She glanced at it and frowned. Excuse me for a moment, she said, stepping into the hallway where Jake was waiting. Is Becca okay? Jake asked immediately. Physically, yes. The baby appears to be healthy, despite the stress. But Jake, I need you to know what we're dealing with here. Dr. Hayes showed him her pager. I just received a message from hospital administration requesting an immediate consultation on Mrs. Blackwood's case. What does that mean? It means Richard Blackwood's influence reaches into this hospital, Dr. Hayes said grimly. Someone with authority is questioning my treatment decisions and requesting that Mrs. Blackwood be released immediately. Jake's military training kicked in, analyzing the threat level and potential responses. Can they force you to release her? Not if I believe she's in medical danger, Dr. Hayes replied. But they can make my life very difficult, and they can certainly influence how this case is documented. From inside the examination room, they could hear Becca's cell phone ringing. Through the partially open door, they heard her answer nervously. Hello, Rick. Even from the hallway, Jake and Dr. Hayes could hear Rick's voice, loud and angry through the phone speaker. Rebecca, I've been very patient, but this nonsense needs to stop immediately. I've spoken with the hospital administration, and they've assured me that you'll be released within the hour. Rick, I'm just getting checked out to make sure the baby's okay, Becca said, her voice small and frightened. The baby is fine. You're fine. What's not fine is my wife spending time with her delinquent brother and making accusations that could damage my reputation. Jake started toward the room, but Dr. Hayes put a restraining hand on his arm. Let him talk, she whispered. I want to hear what he says when he thinks no one else is listening. Rick's voice continued, growing more threatening. Rebecca, I want you to understand something very clearly. Every decision you make tonight affects your future and your child's future. I have documentation of your mental health issues, your financial dependence, and your family's history of instability. If you continue down this path, you'll lose everything. What do you mean? Becca asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. I mean, I'll file for emergency custody of our child the moment it's born. I'll have you declared an unfit mother based on your documented mental health problems and your association with a brother who can't even hold down a stable job. You'll be lucky to get supervised visitation. Dr. Hayes quickly activated the recording function on her phone, capturing Rick's threats. Rick, please, Becca pleaded. I just want to make sure the baby's healthy. The baby's health is my concern, not yours. You've already proven you can't make good decisions. Now I'm sending a car to pick you up. Be ready in 30 minutes. The line went dead, leaving the examination room in heavy silence. Dr. Hayes entered the room, her expression determined. Rebecca, did you hear what I just heard? You were listening? Becca asked, embarrassment coloring her voice. I was protecting my patient, Dr. Hayes replied firmly. and I recorded the entire conversation. Your husband just made several threats that constitute legal evidence of coercive control and intimidation. Jake joined them in the room, his face grim with determination. Becca, you heard what he said. He's planning to take the baby away from you the moment it's born. But he's right about my mental health records, Becca said desperately. I did see a therapist after the miscarriage. I was diagnosed with depression. A judge might believe I'm unfit. Depression following pregnancy loss is completely normal and treatable, Dr. Hayes said firmly. It's not grounds for removing a child from a fit parent, but threatening to weaponize medical records against a patient is grounds for legal action. Dr. Hayes' phone rang, displaying the hospital administrator's number. She declined the call and turned off her phone. Rebecca, I'm recommending that you stay in the hospital overnight for observation, she said. Given your stress levels and the potential for premature labor, it's medically justified. But Rick said he's sending a car, Becca protested. Your husband isn't your doctor, Dr. Hayes replied. I am, and as your physician, I'm determining that you need to remain under medical supervision. Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward the doctor. How long can you keep her here? 24 to 48 hours, medically justified, Dr. Hayes said. But that's not a permanent solution. We need to use that time to develop a plan. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, security called Dr. Hayes to report that several men in expensive suits had arrived at the hospital's main entrance, demanding immediate access to Mrs. Blackwood. Rick's lawyers, Becca said, recognizing the description. Dr. Hayes activated the hospital's patient protection protocol, effectively placing Becca under medical security. But everyone in the room understood that they were only buying time. The real battle for Becca's freedom and her unborn child's future was just beginning. Jake's one-bedroom apartment above Murphy's Hardware had never felt smaller than it did at 2 o'clock in the morning, with his pregnant sister curled up on his couch and the weight of impending confrontation pressing down on all of them. Dr. Hayes had managed to extend Becca's hospital stay by documenting elevated blood pressure and irregular contractions, but they all knew Rick's lawyers would eventually find a way to force her release. I can't believe I signed those papers, Becca said for the 10th time, staring at the copies of legal documents Dr. Hayes had helped them obtain. I gave him control of everything. Jake studied the paperwork by the light of his desk lamp. His military experience had taught him to analyze enemy tactics, and Rick's strategy was becoming clear. Every document was designed to isolate Becca financially and legally. These aren't just control mechanisms, Jake said grimly. They're preparation for a custody battle. He's been planning this for months. The beneficiary changes on Becca's inheritance, the power of attorney documents, even the medical release forms Rick had convinced her to sign. Everything was designed to paint her as mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises if you attempt to return to Murphy's gas station. Let me guess, Becca said, seeing Jake's expression. Rick? He works fast, Jake admitted, but I've been fired from better jobs than that one. What worried Jake more than losing his job was the systematic way Rick was eliminating their resources. Within hours of the gas station incident, Jake had received calls from his landlord, his bank, and even the Veterans Administration office where he received counseling services. The message was clear. Rick Blackwood's influence reached everywhere, and he intended to use it to destroy anyone who protected his wife. Becca's phone rang, displaying their mother's number. She answered hesitantly, putting the call on speaker so Jake could hear. Rebecca, honey, what are you doing? Martha Sullivan's voice was tight with anxiety. Rick called me. He's very upset. Mom, Rick hit me, Becca said simply. I'm 8 months pregnant, and he slapped me in a public parking lot. Oh, sweetheart, I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. Rick's under so much pressure with his business, and you know how pregnancy hormones can make you overreact to things. Jake watched his sister's face crumble as their mother chose Rick's version of events over her own daughter's experience. Mom, there's a handprint bruise on my face, Becca said desperately. Rick told me you fell, Martha replied. He said you've been clumsy lately because of the pregnancy weight. And you believe him over me? There was a long pause before Martha answered. Rebecca, I need you to think about what you're doing. Rick has been very generous to our family. He pays for my assisted living facility, he helped with your father's funeral expenses, and he's promised to set up a college fund for the baby. In exchange for what, Mom? Jake interjected. Becca's safety? Her freedom? Jake, you stay out of this, Martha snapped. You've caused enough problems for this family. Rebecca had a good life before you got involved. A good life? Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. She's covered in bruises, Mom. She's terrified of her own husband. She's confused, Martha said firmly. Pregnancy can affect women's judgment. Rick explained everything to me. Rebecca's been having some mental health issues, and she needs professional help, not encouragement from family members who don't understand her medical situation. Becca looked stricken. Mom, you're supposed to protect me. I am protecting you, Martha replied. I'm protecting you from making a mistake that will ruin your life and your child's future. Rick loves you, Rebecca. He's just trying to help you through a difficult time. After Martha hung up, the apartment fell into heavy silence. Jake watched his sister process the reality that their mother had been completely turned against her. How did he do it? Becca asked quietly. How did he convince her that I'm the problem? Same way he convinced you to sign away your inheritance, Jake replied. Rick's a master manipulator. He identified Mom's vulnerabilities, her financial insecurity, her fear of being alone, and he exploited them. Jake's laptop chimed with an email notification. The message was from Rick's legal team, informing Jake that he was being sued for harassment, interference with a marriage, and defamation of character. He's not just trying to control you, Jake said, showing Becca the email. He's trying to destroy anyone who might help you. Becca read the legal threats and felt her resolve wavering. Jake, maybe Mom's right. Maybe I am overreacting. Rick's never hit me in the face before. Maybe it was just stress. Becca, no. Jake knelt beside the couch, taking his sister's hands in his own. Don't let him make you doubt your own memory. I saw what happened. Dr. Hayes documented your injuries. You're not crazy and you're not overreacting. But Jake could see the doubt creeping into his sister's eyes. Rick's systematic assault on her support system was working. Without their mother's support, without financial resources, and with a newborn baby on the way, returning to Rick was starting to seem like the only viable option. Jake's phone rang again. This time it was Detective Morrison. Jake, we need to talk, Morrison said, but not over the phone. Can you meet me at the diner on 5th Street in an hour? What about Becca? Bring her. And Jake, come prepared for some bad news. The diner was nearly empty at 3 in the morning, just a few truckers and shift workers grabbing coffee and pie. Detective Morrison chose a booth in the back corner, away from other customers. I've been taken off any case involving Richard Blackwood, Morrison said without preamble. My captain was very clear that I'm to have no further contact with you or your sister regarding domestic violence allegations. Rick's influence? Jake asked. Rick's donations, Morrison corrected. Turns out Blackwood Development is a major contributor to the Police Benevolent Fund. The captain doesn't want to jeopardize that relationship over what he called a family dispute. Becca stared into her decaffeinated coffee. So there's no official investigation. There's no official anything, Morrison said grimly. But that doesn't mean we're giving up. Morrison slid a business card across the table. Grace Williams. She's a private investigator, former FBI. She specializes in cases involving wealthy abusers. Can we afford a private investigator? Jake asked. She's offered to work pro bono, Morrison said. Turns out she has a personal interest in bringing down Richard Blackwood. What kind of personal interest? Becca asked. Morrison's expression was grim. She was married to him 12 years ago, before you, Rebecca, Rick's first wife. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Rick had been married before, and he'd never told Becca. More importantly, his first marriage had ended badly enough that his ex-wife was willing to work for free to see him face justice. What happened to her? Becca asked quietly. You'll have to ask her yourself, Morrison said. But I will tell you this. Grace Williams has been building a case against Rick Blackwood for over a decade. She's been waiting for another victim to come forward, someone willing to fight back. As if summoned by their conversation, the diner's door chimed and a woman in her late 30s entered. She was elegant despite the early hour, dressed in a tailored coat and carrying herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Grace Williams, she said, extending her hand to Becca. And you must be Richard's current wife. Current wife? Becca repeated. Grace's smile was sharp as a blade. Oh, my dear, Richard didn't tell you about me, did he? I was Grace Blackwood once upon a time, before I learned the truth about the man I married. Jake studied Grace's face, noting the faint scars near her hairline and the way she unconsciously favored her left arm. What truth? Jake asked. Grace sat down across from them, her expression serious. The truth about what Richard Blackwood does to women who try to leave him, and more importantly, what he's planning to do to you. Outside the diner, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot, its occupants photographing everyone who entered or left the building. Rick's surveillance of his wife and her allies was comprehensive and constant. The war was escalating, and Grace Williams was about to teach the Sullivan siblings how to fight back. Grace Williams Blackwood had the kind of quiet intensity that reminded Jake of the best intelligence officers he'd worked with during his military service. She sat across from him and Becca in the diner booth, methodically laying out photographs and documents like pieces of evidence in a criminal trial. Richard follows a pattern, Grace said, her voice professionally detached despite the personal nature of her revelations. First, he isolates his target from family and friends. Then he creates financial dependence. Finally, he uses pregnancy as the ultimate control mechanism. She slid a photograph across the table. It showed a younger version of Grace with obvious facial bruising and a cast on her left arm. This was taken 11 years ago, 2 weeks after I filed for divorce, Grace said. Richard told the police I fell downstairs in our home, the same stairs I'd walked up and down hundreds of times without incident. Becca studied the photograph, seeing her own future reflected in Grace's injuries. Why didn't anyone help you? The same reason no one's helping you now, Grace replied. Richard owns people. Judges, police administrators, hospital board members, social services directors. He donates enough money to local charities and political campaigns to buy influence where it matters most. Jake leaned forward, his military mind analyzing the intelligence Grace was providing. How did you get away? I didn't, initially, Grace admitted. The first time I tried to leave, Richard had me committed to a private psychiatric facility for 72 hours. He told everyone I was having a nervous breakdown. What changed? Becca asked quietly. Grace's expression hardened. I was 6 months pregnant when Richard pushed me down those stairs. I lost the baby, and I almost died from internal bleeding. That's when I realized Richard would rather see me dead than see me free. The revelation hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Becca instinctively placed both hands over her belly, protecting her unborn child from even the suggestion of such violence. After I recovered, Grace continued, I spent 2 years learning everything I could about Richard's business practices, his associates, and his methods of controlling women. I discovered I wasn't his first victim. She opened a manila folder containing photographs and newspaper clippings. Jennifer Morrison, his college girlfriend, died in a car accident after threatening to expose Richard's academic cheating scandal. Laura Chen, his business partner's daughter, disappeared during a custody dispute over her children. Maria Santos, a journalist who was investigating Richard's development company, found dead in her apartment, ruled a suicide despite evidence of struggle. Jake studied the materials with growing alarm. You think Rick killed these women? I think Richard Blackwood is a sociopathic predator who has been murdering women for 15 years, Grace said bluntly. And I think Rebecca's next on his list. Detective Morrison had been quietly observing the conversation. Now he spoke up. Grace, we've discussed this. Without concrete evidence linking Richard to these deaths, we can't build a criminal case. Which is why I've been gathering that evidence, Grace replied. I've spent years documenting Richard's pattern of abuse, his financial crimes, and his connections to suspicious deaths. She pulled out a thick binder filled with financial records, phone logs, and surveillance photographs. Richard's development company is a front for money laundering, Grace explained. He's been washing cash for organized crime families for over a decade. The millions he claims to have earned through legitimate real estate deals? Most of it comes from drug trafficking and extortion rackets. Jake whistled low. That's federal crime territory. Exactly. And federal investigators don't care about Richard's local political connections, Grace said. I've been building a case to present to the FBI, but I needed one more piece of evidence. What kind of evidence? Becca asked. Grace looked directly at her. A living victim who's willing to testify about Richard's pattern of domestic abuse? Someone whose case can be tied to his other crimes. The weight of Grace's request settled over Becca like a heavy blanket. She was being asked to risk everything: her safety, her child's future, her family relationships, to help bring down a man who had already destroyed multiple lives. What happens to my baby if Richard gets convicted? Becca asked. You get to raise your child in safety, Grace replied. But Rebecca, you need to understand what you're facing. Richard has already filed preliminary paperwork to have you declared an unfit mother. He's planning to take custody of your baby the moment it's born. Jake's phone buzzed with another text message, this one from their mother. Rebecca, Rick has shown me the police reports about your mental health episodes. You need professional help, not legal trouble. Come home before you destroy your child's future. He's turned everyone against you, Grace observed, reading the message over Jake's shoulder. That's part of his pattern. By the time his victims realize they're in danger, they have nowhere to turn. Becca felt the walls closing in around her. Her mother believed Rick's lies, her financial resources were controlled by her abuser, and now she was learning that her husband might be a murderer who'd killed other women in similar situations. I don't have a choice, do I? Becca said quietly. If I go back to Rick, he'll eventually kill me. If I fight him, he'll take my baby and destroy what's left of my family. There's a third option, Grace said. We work together to expose Richard's crimes and put him in federal prison where his local connections can't protect him. Jake studied his sister's face, recognizing the fear and determination warring in her expression. Becca, it's your choice, but whatever you decide, I'll stand with you. Before Becca could respond, Grace's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her expression grew grim. It's my contact at the FBI, she said, answering the call. The conversation was brief but intense. Grace's face grew paler with each exchange. What is it? Jake asked when she hung up. Richard knows we're working together, Grace said. Someone's been feeding him information about our investigation. How is that possible? Morrison asked. Someone with access to police reports and hospital records, Grace replied. Someone who's been telling Richard exactly what evidence we have and what witnesses we've identified. The implication hit them all simultaneously. Rick's influence reached deeper into law enforcement and medical institutions than any of them had realized. We're compromised, Jake said grimly. Worse than that, Grace replied. Richard's accelerating his timeline. He's filing for emergency custody tomorrow morning, and he's having Rebecca committed to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. Becca felt her world tilting. He can do that? With the right judge and the right medical testimony, yes, Grace said. I've seen him do it before. Morrison stood up, his face grim with determination. Then we need to move tonight, before Richard can file those papers. Move how? Jake asked. Grace was already gathering her documents. We're going to grace Richard what he's never experienced before. A fight from someone who knows all his secrets and isn't afraid to use them. As they prepared to leave the diner, none of them noticed the black sedan following at a discreet distance, or the directional microphone that had been recording their entire conversation. Rick Blackwood was always 3 steps ahead of his enemies, and he was about to remind them why no one had ever successfully escaped his control. The prenatal class at St. Mary's Community Center had been Becca's one remaining connection to normalcy. For 6 weeks, she'd sat in a circle with other expectant mothers, learning breathing techniques and discussing the challenges of impending parenthood. She'd never told the other women about Rick's controlling behavior or the escalating tensions at home. But when Rick appeared in the doorway of the classroom, his presence transformed the peaceful environment into something dark and threatening. Rebecca, Rick said, his voice carrying the false warmth he used in public. I've been looking for you everywhere. The other pregnant women looked up from their yoga mats, sensing the undercurrent of tension. Their instructor, a gentle woman named Karen, stepped forward protectively. I'm sorry, sir, but this is a private class for expectant mothers and their partners, Karen said. Are you? I'm Richard Blackwood, Rick interrupted, his tone suggesting that his name should carry immediate recognition and authority. Rebecca's husband. I'm here to take my wife home. Becca remained seated on her mat, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. She could see the confusion and growing alarm in her classmates' faces as they processed the obvious tension between husband and wife. "The class isn't over yet," Becca said quietly, her voice barely audible above the soft music playing in the background. "It is for you," Rick replied, stepping into the room despite Karen's obvious discomfort. "We need to discuss some urgent family matters." "Mr. Blackwood," Karen said, finding her voice, "perhaps you could wait outside until—" "Perhaps you could mind your own business," Rick snapped, his public facade slipping for just a moment. "This is between me and my wife." The room fell silent except for the sound of nervous breathing and shifting bodies. Several women were clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, but none felt confident enough to intervene. Jake arrived at that moment, having followed Rick from the hospital where he'd been visiting Becca. He took in the scene instantly, his sister surrounded by pregnant women, Rick looming over her with barely controlled anger, and an instructor who looked ready to call security. "Becca," Jake said from the doorway, "Dr. Hayes wants to see you back at the hospital. Something about your test results." It was a lie, but it gave Becca an excuse to leave without causing a larger scene. She started to rise from her mat, but Rick placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Rebecca isn't going anywhere with you," Rick said, not bothering to look at Jake. "We've already discussed this." "Actually," said a new voice from behind Jake, "Mrs. Blackwood is exactly where she needs to be." Grace Williams Blackwood entered the classroom, her professional bearing and confident manner immediately changing the dynamic in the room. She carried a briefcase and moved with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "And you are?" Rick asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. "Grace Williams, Mrs. Blackwood's legal advocate," Grace replied smoothly. "I'm here to discuss some urgent matters regarding child custody and domestic violence allegations." The words domestic violence rippled through the room like an electric shock. Several women gasped audibly, and Karen immediately moved closer to Becca in a protective gesture. Rick's face flushed with barely controlled rage. "There are no domestic violence allegations. My wife is suffering from pregnancy-related mental health issues, and she's been influenced by family members with their own agendas." "Is that why she has facial bruising consistent with being slapped?" Grace asked calmly, opening her briefcase and withdrawing a folder of photographs. "Or why her medical records show a pattern of injuries over the past 6 months?" "Those are private medical records," Rick said, his voice rising. "You have no right to—" "I have every right to protect a client who's being abused," Grace interrupted. "And I have documentation from Dr. Patricia Hayes at County General confirming that Mrs. Blackwood has been the victim of repeated domestic violence." The pregnant women in the class were no longer pretending to ignore the confrontation. They stared openly at the drama unfolding before them, some reaching for their phones to call husbands or partners. Karen stepped forward, her voice shaky but determined. "Mr. Blackwood, I think you should leave. This is clearly not the appropriate place for this discussion." "I'm not leaving without my wife," Rick said, his hand tightening on Becca's shoulder. "Rebecca, get up. We're going home." "She's not going anywhere," Jake said, moving closer to his sister. "And if you don't take your hand off her, we're going to have a problem." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds. Rick's grip on Becca's shoulder was tight enough to leave marks, and she winced visibly under the pressure. One of the pregnant women, a teacher named Lisa, who'd become friendly with Becca over the weeks, found her courage. "Rebecca, are you okay? Do you want to go with him?" The direct question forced Becca to confront the reality of her situation in front of witnesses. She could feel Rick's fingers digging into her shoulder, could see the rage building behind his carefully controlled expression. "No," she said quietly, then louder. "No, I don't want to go with him." Rick's hand fell away from her shoulder as if he'd been burned. In all their years together, Becca had never publicly contradicted him, never refused a direct order in front of other people. "Rebecca," Rick said, his voice taking on the tone he used when explaining complex financial matters to what he considered inferior minds, "you're not thinking clearly. The pregnancy hormones are affecting your judgment." "My judgment is fine," Becca replied, standing up from her mat with Jake's help. "It's your behavior that's the problem." Grace watched the exchange with professional interest, recognizing the moment when an abuse victim finally stops accepting responsibility for her abuser's actions. "Mr. Blackwood," Grace said, I should inform you that Mrs. Blackwood has filed for emergency protection orders, and any further contact with her could result in criminal charges. It was another strategic lie, but Rick didn't know that. His expression shifted from anger to calculation as he assessed the legal threat. "This isn't over," he said, addressing Grace rather than Becca. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." "Actually, I know exactly what I'm interfering with," Grace replied. "I was married to you for 3 years, Richard. I know precisely how you operate." The recognition hit Rick like a physical blow. For the first time since entering the classroom, he looked genuinely surprised and off balance. "Grace," he said, the name escaping his lips like a curse. "I thought you were in therapy." "I was. For trauma recovery. After you pushed me down the stairs and I lost our baby." The room fell into shocked silence. The pregnant women stared between Grace and Rick, processing the implications of her revelation. Rick's carefully constructed public persona crumbled in real time. "You're lying. You fell. Everyone knows you fell." "Everyone knows what you paid them to believe," Grace corrected. "But I have medical records, photographs, and witness statements that tell a different story." Rick looked around the room, suddenly aware that his conversation was being overheard by multiple witnesses. His lawyer's training kicked in, and he realized he was creating evidence that could be used against him. "This conversation is over," he said, backing toward the door. "Rebecca, when you come to your senses, you know where to find me." After Rick left, the classroom remained silent for several minutes. The pregnant women stared at Becca with a mixture of sympathy and horror, finally understanding why she'd seemed so anxious and withdrawn during their sessions together. Karen was the first to speak. "Rebecca, are you safe? Do you have somewhere to stay?" "She's staying with me," Jake said, his arm protectively around his sister's shoulders. Lisa, the teacher who'd found the courage to ask if Becca wanted to leave with Rick, approached cautiously. "I'm sorry we didn't speak up sooner. We knew something was wrong, but we didn't know how to help." "You helped tonight," Becca said gratefully. "You gave me the courage to say no." Grace packed her briefcase efficiently, already planning their next moves. The public confrontation had been risky but necessary. Rick now knew that Becca had professional legal support and witnesses to his behavior. But it also meant he would escalate his efforts to regain control. The phone call Grace received as they left the community center confirmed her worst fears. "That was my FBI contact," Grace said grimly. "Richard filed for emergency custody an hour ago. He's claiming that Rebecca is mentally unstable and poses a danger to their unborn child." Jake felt his protective instincts surge. "Can he do that?" "With the right judge, yes," Grace replied. "And Richard knows exactly which judges owe him favors." As they walked to their cars, none of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across from the community center, its occupant photographing their every move and uploading the images to a secure server. The war for Becca's freedom was about to move into federal court, where Rick's local connections would be tested against the power of documented evidence and witness testimony. But Rick Blackwood had been playing this game for 15 years, and he'd never lost a custody battle yet. The federal courthouse in downtown was a fortress of marble and glass, its imposing architecture designed to intimidate those who entered seeking justice. Jake stood on the steps with Becca and Grace, watching Rick's legal team arrive in a convoy of Blacktown cars. 5 lawyers, Jake observed, his military training automatically assessing the opposition. "Rick's bringing serious firepower." Grace checked her watch nervously. "Our attorney is running late. Sarah Chen is excellent, but she's handling this pro bono, so she's juggling multiple cases." Becca shifted uncomfortably, her 8-month pregnant belly making it difficult to stand for long periods. "What happens if Rick wins today?" "He gets temporary custody of the baby when it's born," Grace said grimly, "and you get supervised visitation while undergoing court-ordered psychiatric evaluation." "Based on lies," Jake added angrily. "Based on carefully constructed documentation," Grace corrected. "Rick's been building a case against Rebecca for months. Every therapy session after her miscarriage, every medical visit, every financial decision, he's twisted it all to paint her as unstable." Detective Morrison appeared at the top of the courthouse steps, his expression grave. Despite being officially removed from the case, he'd been quietly gathering evidence that could help their cause. "I have bad news and worse news." Morrison said without preamble. The bad news is that Rick's legal team has a psychiatric evaluation claiming Rebecca is suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. I'm not even postpartum yet, Becca protested. The worst news, Morrison continued, is that the evaluation was conducted by Dr. Marcus Webb, who happens to be Rick's golf partner and a major investor in Blackwood Development. Jake's hands clenched into fists. So the fix is in. It gets worse, Grace said, reading a message on her phone. Sarah Chen just texted. She's been disqualified from representing Rebecca due to a conflict of interest claim filed by Rick's team. What conflict? Jake demanded. They're claiming I'm paying her to manufacture evidence against Rick, Grace explained. Without Sarah, Rebecca has no legal representation. Becca felt the walls closing in around her once again. So Rick gets the baby, and I get declared insane. Not if I have anything to say about it, Jake said grimly. Grace studied Jake's expression, recognizing something dangerous in his eyes. Jake, what are you thinking? I'm thinking some battles can't be won in courtrooms, Detective, Jake said, echoing the words from their outline. I'm thinking maybe it's time Rick learned what happens when you threaten a Ranger's family. Morrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. Jake, whatever you're planning, don't do it. Rick has too much protection, too many connections. If you go after him directly, you'll end up in prison. Maybe, Jake agreed, but my sister will be safe. Before anyone could respond, Jake's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Parking garage, level B2. Come alone if you want information that can destroy Richard Blackwood. Jake showed the message to the others. Grace frowned at the screen. It could be a trap, she warned. Or it could be someone who knows Rick's secrets, Jake replied. Either way, I have to check it out. Not alone, Grace said firmly. If someone has evidence against Richard, they might be willing to share it with me too. They left Becca with Detective Morrison and descended into the courthouse parking garage. Level B2 was dimly lit and nearly deserted, with concrete pillars creating shadows that could hide multiple threats. A figure emerged from behind one of the pillars, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Are you Jake Sullivan? The man asked nervously. Depends who's asking, Jake replied, his posture automatically shifting to a defensive stance. My name is David Park. I'm Richard Blackwood's accountant. The man glanced around nervously, as if expecting Rick to materialize from the shadows. I have information about Richard's business practices that could put him in federal prison. Grace stepped forward, her FBI training kicking in. What kind of information? Park opened a briefcase and withdrew several thick folders. Richard's been laundering money for the Torino crime family for 8 years. I have documentation of every transaction, every shell company, every fake real estate deal used to clean dirty money. Jake studied the nervous accountant. Why come forward now? Because Richard ordered me to falsify financial records for his custody case, Park said. He wants me to create documents showing that Rebecca has been stealing from his business accounts. When I refused, he threatened my family. Grace flipped through one of the folders, her eyes widening at the scope of the financial crimes documented inside. This is enough to bring RICO charges against Richard and his entire organization. There's more, Park said. Richard keeps detailed files on everyone he's bought. Judges, police officials, hospital administrators, social services directors. He calls it his insurance policy. Where are these files? Jake asked. Hidden in a safe in his office. The combination is his first wife's birthday, January 15th, 1983. Grace's face went pale. He uses my birthday as his safe combination? He said it was fitting, Park explained, since you were the one who taught him how dangerous it could be to trust people. Jake processed the intelligence with military efficiency. David, are you willing to testify about what you know? If the FBI can guarantee my family's protection, yes, Park replied. But Richard can't know I've talked to you. If he finds out. Park didn't need to finish the threat. Everyone understood what Rick did to people who betrayed him. Grace was already on her phone, calling her FBI contact. Agent Martinez, I have a witness ready to provide evidence of extensive RICO violations by Richard Blackwood. While Grace coordinated with federal law enforcement, Jake's phone rang. It was Morrison, calling from upstairs. Jake, you need to get back here immediately, Morrison said urgently. Rebecca's gone into labor, and Rick's lawyers are arguing that the baby should be taken into protective custody the moment it's born. Jake felt his world tilt. How long has she been in labor? Contractions started about 10 minutes ago. Dr. Hayes is on her way to the hospital, but Rick's team is demanding that court-approved medical personnel oversee the delivery. Court-approved meaning Rick's people, Jake said grimly. Exactly. You need to get to County General now. Jake looked at Grace, who was still coordinating with the FBI. The federal investigation could take hours or days to mobilize, but Becca needed protection immediately. Grace, I have to go to the hospital, Jake said. My sister's having her baby. Grace ended her phone call and grabbed Jake's arm. Jake, if you go to that hospital, Richard will have you arrested for violating the custody order. Then I'll be arrested, Jake replied, but I won't let him take Becca's baby. David Park watched the exchange nervously. There's something else you should know. Richard has a contact in the hospital, Dr. Amanda Foster in pediatrics. She's been paid to declare newborns medically at risk if Richard needs custody leverage. The information hit Jake like a physical blow. Rick's corruption reached even into the maternity ward. Then we stop him, Jake said grimly. Whatever it takes. As they rushed toward the hospital, none of them realized that Rick's surveillance team had been monitoring the parking garage meeting. Rick now knew about David Park's betrayal, Grace's FBI contacts, and Jake's determination to protect his sister. The final confrontation was about to begin in the place where life begins, and where Rick had already arranged for it to end if necessary. County General's maternity ward buzzed with an unusual level of security activity. Jake arrived to find hospital guards stationed at every entrance, and Rick's lawyers clustered around the nursing station, armed with court documents and threatening legal action against anyone who interfered with their client's parental rights. Where's my sister? Jake demanded, approaching the information desk. Room 314, the nurse replied nervously. But sir, there are legal restrictions on who can visit Mrs. Blackwood. Jake was already moving toward the elevators when Detective Morrison intercepted him. Jake, slow down, Morrison said urgently. Rick's got this place locked down. 2 of his security people are posted outside Becca's room, and his lawyers have convinced hospital administration that you're a threat to patient safety. Where's Dr. Hayes? Stuck in legal discussions with hospital counsel, Morrison replied. Rick's team is challenging her authority to treat Rebecca, claiming she's biased due to her domestic violence activism. Jake felt his protective instincts surge beyond the breaking point. So Rick gets to control who delivers his own child? That's the plan, Morrison said grimly. Dr. Amanda Foster from pediatrics has been assigned as the primary physician. According to David Park's intel, she's been paid to find reasons to separate newborns from mothers Rick wants to control. Grace appeared at Jake's side, slightly out of breath from running through the hospital corridors. The FBI is mobilizing, but they need at least 2 hours to get warrants and coordinate with local law enforcement. Becca doesn't have 2 hours, Jake said, hearing a scream of pain echoing from the upper floors. That baby's coming now. The 3 of them rode the elevator to the 3rd floor in tense silence. When the doors opened, Jake immediately assessed the tactical situation. 2 large men in suits stood outside room 314, both with the alert posture of professional security personnel. Rick himself was visible through the partially open door, speaking in low, urgent tones with Dr. Foster. Becca, Jake called toward the room, ignoring the security guards who immediately moved to block his path. Jake! Becca's voice was strained with pain and relief. Jake, they won't let me see Dr. Hayes. They're saying she's not qualified to deliver my baby. Ma'am, you need to step away, one of the security guards said, placing a firm hand on Jake's chest. Jake looked down at the hand, then back up at the guard's face. I'd suggest you remove your hand before I remove it for you. The guard reached inside his jacket, but Grace quickly intervened. I'm Mrs. Blackwood's legal representative, she announced, showing her credentials. My client has requested that her brother be present during delivery, which is her legal right under patient advocacy statutes. Rick emerged from the hospital room, his expression cold with calculation. Grace, I should have known you'd be involved in this circus. Hello, Richard, Grace replied evenly. I see you're still manipulating medical situations to serve your control fantasies. I'm protecting my child from an unstable mother and her criminal family members, Rick shot back. Jake stepped closer to his former brother-in-law, his military bearing making him seem larger and more dangerous than his actual size. The only criminal here is you, Rick, and the only unstable person is a man who threatens pregnant women. Gentlemen, Dr. Foster appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand and nervous energy radiating from her posture. Mrs. Blackwood's labor is progressing rapidly. We need to focus on medical priorities. What are those priorities, Doctor? Grace asked pointedly. Dr. Foster glanced at Rick before answering. Given Mrs. Blackwood's documented mental health issues and the stress of recent legal proceedings, we're concerned about her ability to safely deliver without complications. What kind of complications? Morrison asked, his police training recognizing the setup. Postpartum psychosis, potential harm to the infant, inability to make rational medical decisions, Dr. Foster recited, clearly working from a prepared script. From inside the room, Becca screamed again, the sound cutting through the legal posturing like a knife. That's my sister in there, Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. And if you don't let me see her right now, we're going to have a problem that your security guards can't solve. Rick smiled coldly. Jake, you're not thinking clearly. Rebecca's about to give birth to my child, and as the father, I have legal authority over medical decisions. Your role in this situation is exactly nothing. Unless Mrs. Blackwood specifically requests his presence, Grace interjected, which she has, multiple times in front of witnesses. Dr. Hayes chose that moment to arrive, slightly out of breath and clearly frustrated with whatever legal discussions had delayed her. What the hell is going on here? Dr. Hayes demanded. I'm Rebecca's attending physician, and I need immediate access to my patient. Dr. Hayes, Dr. Foster said nervously, hospital administration has requested that I take primary responsibility for Mrs. Blackwood's delivery due to potential complications with... Complications? Dr. Hayes interrupted. Rebecca Sullivan is a healthy 29-year-old woman with a normal pregnancy. What complications are you talking about? Dr. Foster glanced at Rick again, seeking guidance. Mental health complications that could affect her ability to safely deliver. Dr. Hayes studied the younger physician with barely concealed contempt. Amanda, Rebecca's mental health is stable. I've been monitoring her condition for weeks. What mental health complications are you referring to? The challenge forced Dr. Foster to either produce actual medical evidence or admit she was working from non-medical instructions. Well, the legal documentation provided by Mr. Blackwood's attorney suggests, I don't practice law, Amanda. I practice medicine. Dr. Hayes cut her off. And medically speaking, Rebecca needs experienced obstetric care, not legal manipulation. From inside room 314, Becca's voice rose in panic. Something's wrong. Something's wrong with the baby. The medical emergency immediately shifted everyone's priorities. Dr. Hayes pushed past the security guards and Dr. Foster, with Jake close behind her. Rick followed, his face pale with genuine concern for the first time. Becca was on the hospital bed, her face contorted with pain and fear. The contractions stopped, but something feels wrong inside, like the baby's not moving right. Dr. Hayes immediately began examining her patient, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over Becca's swollen belly. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as she palpated different areas. We need an ultrasound immediately, Dr. Hayes said urgently. The baby may have shifted into a dangerous position. Dr. Foster moved to comply, but Rick grabbed her arm. Wait, I want a second opinion. Dr. Hayes spun on him, her professional demeanor replaced by protective fury. Richard, your wife and child are in potential medical danger. This is not the time for legal games. Everything Rick does is a legal game, Grace said grimly, even when lives are at stake. The ultrasound machine was wheeled into the room, and Dr. Hayes began the examination. The grainy black and white image on the screen showed a baby in obvious distress, the umbilical cord wrapped around its neck. Cord prolapse, Dr. Hayes announced. We need to get this baby out immediately, or we're going to lose it. The medical crisis temporarily united everyone in the room around a single priority, saving the baby's life. Dr. Foster assisted Dr. Hayes in preparing for an emergency delivery, while Rick stood frozen with the first genuine fear Jake had ever seen in the man's eyes. Is the baby going to be okay? Becca asked through her pain. If we move fast, Dr. Hayes replied, already preparing instruments. Rebecca, I need you to push exactly when I tell you to, and stop exactly when I tell you to stop. The baby's life depends on precise timing. For the next 20 minutes, the room focused entirely on the medical emergency. Jake held his sister's hand while she fought to bring her daughter safely into the world, and even Rick's security guard stood respectfully quiet during the life and death struggle. When baby Emma Grace Sullivan finally emerged, purple and silent, Dr. Hayes worked frantically to clear her airways and stimulate breathing. The seconds stretched like hours until a thin, angry wail filled the room. "She's breathing," Dr. Hayes announced, and everyone in the room exhaled collectively. But as Dr. Hayes cleaned and examined the newborn, Rick stepped forward with a document in his hand. "Dr. Foster," he said, "I need you to examine the infant for signs of medical distress that would require immediate intervention." Grace recognized the setup immediately. "Richard, what are you doing?" Rick's expression had returned to cold calculation. "I'm protecting my daughter from a mother who put her at risk through poor medical decisions and lifestyle choices." Dr. Foster reluctantly approached the healthy, crying baby. "Mr. Blackwood, the infant appears to be in good condition despite the cord complications." "Look closer," Rick said meaningfully. "I'm sure you'll find something that requires protective custody." The naked corruption of the moment was too much for Dr. Hayes. "Amanda, if you falsify this medical examination, I'll report you to the state medical board and testify personally at your license review hearing." Dr. Foster looked between Rick and Dr. Hayes, caught between corruption and professional ethics. Finally, her medical training won out. "The infant is healthy and shows no signs of distress beyond normal birth complications," she announced. Rick's face darkened with rage. "Dr. Foster, I suggest you reconsider your assessment. And I suggest you leave this hospital before I have security remove you," Dr. Hayes replied. But Rick wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and made a call that everyone in the room could hear. "Judge Whitman, Richard Blackwood. I need that emergency custody order executed immediately. Yes, right now. The infant has been born, and the mother is showing signs of postpartum psychosis." Becca, exhausted from delivery but alert enough to understand the threat, struggled to sit up in bed. "I'm not psychotic. I just gave birth to a healthy baby." "Rebecca, you've been under tremendous stress, and your mental health history suggests you're at high risk for harming yourself or the infant," Rick said, his tone taking on the false concern he used when manipulating medical professionals. Grace was already on her phone, calling her FBI contact, but federal warrants took time, and Rick's local judicial connections could act immediately. Within minutes, 2 new security guards arrived with a court order transferring custody of baby Emma Grace to her father, pending a full psychiatric evaluation of her mother. Jake watched them prepare to take his niece away from his sister, and something primal and protective exploded in his chest. "No," he said simply. "Jake," Morrison warned, recognizing the dangerous shift in his friend's demeanor. "I said no," Jake repeated, moving between the security guards and the baby. "This little girl stays with her mother." Rick smiled coldly. "Jake, you're interfering with a court order. That's a felony." "Good," Jake replied. "Then you'll have something real to charge me with instead of these manufactured accusations against my sister." The standoff in the hospital room stretched taut with tension. Rick's security guards reached for their weapons, but Jake's military training had already assessed every threat in the room and calculated his response. But before the confrontation could escalate further, the hospital room door burst open. FBI agent Martinez entered with 4 federal agents, their badges clearly displayed, and arrest warrants in hand. "Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy," Agent Martinez announced. "You have the right to remain silent." Rick's face went white with shock. "This is impossible. I have protection." "Not from federal crimes," Grace said with satisfaction. "Your accountant, David Park, has been very cooperative with federal investigators." Dr. Foster looked confused as FBI agents surrounded Rick. "What's happening?" "Your employer is being arrested for running a criminal enterprise," Agent Martinez explained. "And Dr. Foster will be reviewing your medical records and financial accounts to determine your level of involvement." Dr. Foster's face crumbled as she realized her corruption had been exposed. "I never hurt any babies. I needed the money for my mother's cancer treatments." That's for the courts to decide, Agent Martinez said. As Rick was being handcuffed, he looked directly at Becca, his expression promising future retaliation. This isn't over, Rebecca. I'll find a way to get my daughter back. No, you won't, Grace said firmly, because you're going to be in federal prison for the next 20 years. Jake watched his former brother-in-law being led away in handcuffs, feeling a satisfaction deeper than any military victory he'd ever achieved. But his attention quickly returned to his sister and his newborn niece. Becca, how are you feeling? He asked gently. Becca looked down at baby Emma Grace, who was nursing contentedly despite all the chaos around her birth. I feel free, she said quietly. For the first time in 4 years, I feel completely free. Dr. Hayes finished her post-delivery examinations and smiled at the new mother. Rebecca, you and Emma are both in excellent health. There are no medical reasons why you can't take your daughter home whenever you're ready. Home, Becca repeated as if testing the word. I don't really have a home anymore. Yes, you do, Jake said firmly. We'll figure it out together. Family takes care of family. Detective Morrison approached the bed, his expression relieved. Becca, with Rick's arrest, all the custody orders and psychiatric evaluation demands are voided. You have full legal custody of your daughter. Grace was reviewing legal documents with Agent Martinez, ensuring that every aspect of Rick's case was properly documented. Rebecca, you're going to need to testify at Richard's trial. Are you prepared for that? Becca looked down at her daughter, drawing strength from the tiny life she'd fought so hard to protect. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he never hurts another woman the way he hurt me. As the FBI agents finished processing the scene and hospital staff returned to normal medical procedures, Jake found himself alone with his sister and niece for the first time since the gas station parking lot confrontation. Becca, he said quietly, I'm sorry it took so long for us to find our way back to each other. We found our way back exactly when we needed to, Becca replied. Emma Grace is going to grow up knowing she has an uncle who would fight the world to protect her. Jake gently touched his niece's tiny hand, feeling her fingers wrap around his thumb with surprising strength. She's going to grow up knowing she has a mother who was brave enough to fight back when it mattered most, he said. Outside the hospital room, Grace finished her conversations with federal agents and prepared to leave. Her 12-year quest for justice against Richard Blackwood was finally complete. But as she walked down the hospital corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling that Rick's arrest was only the beginning of a larger reckoning. Men like Richard Blackwood didn't operate in isolation, and his criminal empire had connections that reached far beyond what they'd uncovered. Still, for tonight, justice had been served, and a baby girl named Emma Grace would go home with her mother instead of being raised by a monster. It was enough. It had to be enough. 6 weeks after Emma Grace's dramatic birth, Jake sat in the witness waiting area of the federal courthouse, reviewing his testimony notes one final time. The prosecution's case against Richard Blackwood had grown beyond money laundering charges to include domestic violence, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to commit murder. Grace Williams Blackwood emerged from the courtroom, her expression cautiously optimistic. David Park's testimony was devastating. He had documentation of every illegal transaction, every bribe, every threat Rick made over the past 8 years. How's Becca holding up? Jake asked, nodding toward the courtroom, where his sister was delivering her testimony about years of systematic abuse. She's stronger than I expected, Grace replied. When she described Rick's pattern of isolating her from family and controlling her finances, 3 jurors were visibly emotional. Detective Morrison joined them, carrying a thick folder of evidence. The FBI found Rick's insurance files in his office safe. Just like David Park said, detailed records of every judge, police official, and medical professional Rick had compromised over the years. Including Dr. Foster? Jake asked. She's already agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges, Morrison confirmed. Turns out Rick had been blackmailing her over some medical school loan fraud from 10 years ago. Through the courthouse windows, Jake could see media vans lined up on the street. Rick's arrest had become a major news story, with reporters dubbing it the Millionaire Monster case. Any word on the other victims Grace identified? Jake asked. Grace's expression darkened. Jennifer Morrison's family is pushing for her case to be reopened as a murder investigation. The FBI found evidence that Rick tampered with her car before the fatal accident. And Laura Chen? Still missing, but federal agents are excavating property Rick owned during the time of her disappearance. The courtroom doors opened and Becca emerged, visibly drained but walking with the confident posture of someone who'd finally told her complete truth to the world. Jake immediately stood to embrace his sister. How did it go? Rick's lawyer tried to make me look mentally unstable, but Grace prepared me well, Becca said. When he asked about my therapy sessions after the miscarriage, I explained exactly why I needed counseling after Rick pushed me down the stairs. The jury heard about the miscarriage? Morrison asked. Everything, Becca confirmed. Dr. Hayes testified about my medical records. Grace provided documentation of Rick's pattern with previous victims, and David Park connected the financial abuse to Rick's money laundering operation. Grace checked her phone for updates from the FBI agents still investigating Rick's criminal empire. Agent Martinez says they've arrested 12 other people connected to Rick's operation, including 2 judges and a police captain. The captain who removed Morrison from the domestic violence investigation? Jake asked. Among others, Grace confirmed. Rick's corruption network was extensive, but David Park's financial records gave federal investigators a roadmap to follow. Through the courthouse windows, they could see Martha Sullivan approaching with baby Emma Grace in a carrier. Jake's relationship with his mother had been slowly healing since Rick's arrest, and the revelation of how thoroughly he'd manipulated the entire family. How's Mom adjusting to everything? Becca asked Jake quietly. She's embarrassed about choosing Rick's version of events over yours, but she's working hard to make it right, Jake replied. Taking care of Emma while you testify has been good for both of them. Martha entered the waiting area, looking older and more fragile than she had before learning the truth about her son-in-law's criminal activities. How did the testimony go, sweetheart? Martha asked, gently transferring Emma Grace to Becca's arms. I told the truth, Mom. All of it. Martha's eyes filled with tears. Rebecca, I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. I should have protected you instead of worrying about losing Rick's financial support. You were manipulated too, Mom, Becca said generously. Rick spent years convincing all of us that his version of reality was the only accurate one. The courtroom doors opened again, and Agent Martinez appeared, his expression grim with professional satisfaction. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury has reached a verdict, he announced. They filed back into the courtroom, taking seats in the gallery behind the prosecution table. Rick sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suits replaced by standard jail attire. The contrast was stark. The millionaire real estate mogul had been reduced to just another criminal defendant. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged teacher who'd paid close attention throughout the trial, stood with a piece of paper in his hands. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charges of domestic violence and witness intimidation, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts continued for several minutes, covering 14 separate felony charges. Rick was found guilty on every count. Judge Harrison reviewed his notes before addressing the defendant. Mr. Blackwood, your crimes represent a systematic abuse of power that extended from your personal relationships to your business practices and into the institutions meant to protect citizens from people exactly like you. Rick remained impassive, but Jake could see the tension in his shoulders. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, Judge Harrison announced. Additionally, all assets connected to your criminal enterprise are subject to forfeiture, with funds designated for victim compensation. As Rick was led away in shackles, he turned one final time to look at Becca. But instead of the fear she'd lived with for 4 years, she met his gaze with calm strength. It's over, she whispered to Emma Grace, who was sleeping peacefully despite the courtroom drama surrounding her birth and early life. Outside the courthouse, Grace addressed the gathered media, while Jake, Becca, and Morrison stood nearby. Richard Blackwood's conviction sends a clear message that wealth and connections cannot protect domestic abusers from justice, Grace said firmly. But this case also highlights the need for better training among law enforcement and medical professionals to recognize the sophisticated control tactics used by wealthy abusers. A reporter called out a question. Ms. Williams Blackwood, what's next for you? I'm establishing a foundation to help other domestic violence survivors navigate the legal system when their abusers have significant financial resources. Grace replied, too many women die because they believe their abusers are too powerful to challenge. After the media interviews concluded, the group gathered for a quiet dinner at Jake's favorite diner, the same place where Grace had first approached them with evidence of Rick's crimes. So what happens now? Martha asked, bouncing Emma Grace gently on her lap. Now we rebuild, Becca said simply. I've got my inheritance back thanks to the asset forfeiture. Emma has a college fund that Rick can never touch, and Jake's starting a veteran advocacy program with the VA. Jake raised his coffee cup in a toast. To family that fights for each other. To women who refuse to stay silent, Grace added. To justice served cold, Morrison concluded. As they left the diner, Jake noticed a black sedan following at a distance. Old habits from their surveillance during Rick's investigation. But this time, the car contained federal agents ensuring their continued safety, not Rick's thugs planning their destruction. Emma Grace gurgled contentedly in her mother's arms, oblivious to the battle that had been fought for her future. She would grow up in a world where her mother was free, her uncle was nearby, and her grandmother was learning to choose family over financial security. It wasn't the ending any of them had expected when Jake first stepped into that gas station parking lot 6 months earlier, but it was the ending they'd all fought to achieve, together. 1 year later, Jake stood in the same gas station parking lot where everything had begun, but this time he wasn't wearing a clerk's uniform. His new nonprofit organization, Ranger Family Services, had just received a federal grant to expand veteran support programs throughout the region. Emma Grace, now a toddler taking her first wobbly steps, giggled as Jake demonstrated basic self-defense moves in slow motion. Her balance was still uncertain, but her determination reminded him strongly of her mother's courage during their darkest days. Uncle Jake teaching you to be tough? Becca asked, approaching with a picnic basket and a smile that had taken months to fully return to her eyes. Teaching her that Sullivan women don't back down from anyone, Jake replied, scooping his niece up for a hug. Becca had used her restored inheritance to complete her nursing degree, finding purpose in helping other domestic violence survivors navigate the medical system. Her own experience with corrupted healthcare providers had shown her how crucial it was to have advocates who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Grace should be here soon, Becca said, checking her phone. She's bringing someone she wants us to meet. Grace Williams Blackwood's foundation had grown rapidly over the past year, helping dozens of women escape wealthy, controlling partners. Her success rate was nearly perfect, largely because she understood the psychology and tactics of affluent abusers better than anyone else in the field. Detective Morrison approached across the parking lot, now wearing lieutenant's bars thanks to his role in exposing the corruption in his department. The investigation that had begun with Rick Blackwood had ultimately led to cleaning house throughout local law enforcement. How's the new job, Lieutenant? Jake asked, shaking Morrison's hand. Busier than I expected, Morrison replied. Turns out when you remove corrupt cops, the honest ones have to work twice as hard to rebuild community trust. Martha Sullivan emerged from Jake's pickup truck, where she'd been organizing supplies for their picnic. Her relationship with both her children had strengthened considerably once Rick's manipulation was removed from their family dynamic. Emma Grace, come see what Grandma brought for lunch, Martha called, and the little girl immediately toddled toward her grandmother with arms outstretched. As they set up their picnic in the small park adjacent to the gas station, Grace's car pulled into the lot. She stepped out with a woman Jake didn't recognize, someone in her 30s with the cautious posture of a recent trauma survivor. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Sarah Chen, Grace announced. She's Rick's most recent victim, and she needs our help. Sorry. Sarah Chen was Asian American, elegant despite her obvious anxiety, and carrying herself like someone who'd recently escaped a dangerous situation. Rick had another victim after me? Becca asked, her protective instincts immediately activated. He was corresponding with Sarah from prison, Grace explained. Apparently, he convinced her that he was wrongly imprisoned and that his ex-wife and former victims had conspired against him. Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaky but determined. He told me he was innocent, that he'd been framed by vindictive women who couldn't accept that their relationships had ended. I believed him until what? Jake asked gently. Until he asked me to visit him in prison and bring specific items, Sarah continued. Items that would help him escape. When I realized what he was really asking me to do, I understood that everything you testified about was true. Morrison's expression sharpened with professional interest. Did you report the escape plan to prison officials? That's how I found Grace, Sarah replied. The FBI agents investigating Rick's escape attempt connected me with her foundation. Grace pulled out a folder of documents. Rick's been running his old manipulation playbook from prison, love-bombing vulnerable women through prison pen pal services, then gradually drawing them into criminal activities. How many women? Becca asked. At least 12 that we've identified, Grace said grimly. The FBI is investigating all of them, but Sarah is the only one who realized what was happening before she got in too deep. Jake studied Sarah's face, recognizing the same combination of fear and determination he'd seen in his sister's eyes a year earlier. What do you need from us? Rick convinced me to invest my savings in what he called legal defense funds, Sarah explained. I gave him almost everything I had. I'm broke, homeless, and I don't have family who can help me. You have family now, Becca said immediately. We'll figure this out together. Emma Grace, oblivious to the serious adult conversation, continued playing with her toys while the group discussed how to help Rick's latest victim rebuild her life. Sarah can stay in my spare bedroom while she gets back on her feet, Grace offered, and my foundation can help with legal services to recover any money she lost to Rick's schemes. I can provide employment references and help with job placement, Morrison added. We've got a good network of employers who support domestic violence survivors. Jake watched his family, biological and chosen, rally around someone they'd never met simply because she needed help. It was exactly the opposite of Rick's approach to relationships, which had been based on control, isolation, and exploitation. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. Rick told me he's been planning something for when he gets out of prison. Something involving Emma Grace. The group fell silent, processing the threat to the innocent child playing nearby. Rick was sentenced to 25 years without parole, Morrison said carefully. He won't be eligible for release until Emma's in her 20s. Unless he escapes, Sarah replied. He's been very detailed about his plans for revenge against everyone who testified against him. Grace pulled out her phone to call Agent Martinez. We need to inform the FBI about this immediately. Jake felt his protective instincts surge as he looked at his niece. Rick's not getting anywhere near Emma Grace. Not now. Not in 20 years. Not ever. Jake, Becca said gently, he's in maximum security federal prison. Even if he wanted to escape, it's not possible. Rick spent 15 years doing impossible things, Jake replied grimly. I'm not underestimating him again. As they finished their picnic and prepared to leave, Jake noticed Sarah watching Emma Grace play with the wistful expression of someone who'd lost her chance at normalcy. Sarah, Jake said quietly, Rick's manipulation wasn't your fault. He's a professional predator who's been perfecting his techniques for decades. I should have seen through his lies, Sarah replied. I'm a college graduate. I have a good job. I'm not stupid. Neither was I, Becca said, joining their conversation. Intelligence doesn't protect you from emotional manipulation. Rick targets smart, successful women because we're more likely to have resources he can exploit. Grace gathered her papers and prepared to drive Sarah to her new temporary home. The most important thing is that you recognized the danger and got out. Many women don't. As the group prepared to part ways, Jake felt a deep sense of completion. The gas station parking lot that had been the site of his sister's public humiliation was now the place where their extended family gathered to protect other victims and celebrate their survival. Emma Grace ran to each adult for goodbye hugs, her innocent joy a reminder of what they'd all been fighting to protect. Uncle Jake, play more fighting games next week? She asked in her developing vocabulary. Every week, sweetheart, Jake promised. Uncle Jake will always be here to teach you to be strong. As they walked back to their cars, Becca took Jake's arm. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been working at that gas station that night? Jake considered the question seriously. I think you would have found another way to survive. You're stronger than you knew. Maybe, Becca agreed, but I'm grateful I didn't have to find out. They drove away from the gas station as the sun set behind them, leaving behind the place where their nightmare had begun and their new life had been born. Emma Grace fell asleep in her car seat, dreaming innocent dreams in a world where her mother was free, her uncle was nearby, and monsters like Rick Blackwood were locked away where they could never hurt anyone again. But in a maximum security prison 300 miles away, Rick Blackwood sat in his cell, writing letters to women he'd never met, spinning new webs of manipulation and planning for a future that everyone else believed would never come. The Sullivan family had won their battle, but the war against predators like Rick would continue for generations. The best they could do was teach Emma Grace to recognize danger, give her the tools to fight back, and surround her with people who would protect her no matter what. It was enough. It had to be enough. As Jake tucked his niece into her crib that night, he whispered the promise he'd made in that gas station parking lot. Family takes care of family. Always. Emma Grace smiled in her sleep, secure in the knowledge that she was loved, protected, and free. If you're ready to hear how one slap exposed an entire criminal conspiracy, hit that like button to let me know you're here for the full story. Drop a comment telling me what you think happened next. And don't forget to subscribe because stories like this deserve to be heard. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming.